Hi, History Hoppers. My name is Lindsay Sedano, and I wrote a book called History Quest United States, and I'm going to read you chapter 24 from it. It's called September 11th. The history of the United States, like the history of any country, contains moments of joy and celebration, as well as periods of sorrow and grief. You've learned how amazed and excited Americans were by inventions such as the incandescent light bulb and medical breakthroughs such as the polio vaccine. The announcement of such discoveries makes us feel as if anything is possible. You've also learned about many sad times, such as when legions of mourners came out to pay their respects to President Abraham Lincoln as his body slowly returned home to Illinois aboard the Lincoln Special. At times like those, the nation mourns. Today, it's time to talk about another moment of national sorrow. Even though this is a story of pain and grief, it's also a story of heroism and of citizens pulling together to support each other through a scary experience. September 11th, 2001 started out like any normal Tuesday. In the eastern region of the United States, the weather was clear and beautiful. The cloudless sky was so vividly blue that it almost looked like a child's crayon drawing. People went about their business. Kids climbed into big yellow buses and headed off to school. Adults hit the highways or crammed onto crowded subway cars to get to work. People made small talk, just as they normally do. It seemed like a completely pleasant, typical late summer day. But at 8:46 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, our country changed forever. An airplane crashed into a 110-story skyscraper called the North Tower of the World Trade Center, a business complex in New York City. The building was just filling up with thousands of people who were getting ready to start their workdays. Just after the plane hit, nobody knew whether it was an accident or an attack. Of course, that didn't matter at the time. Those inside the building were only trying to escape as safely and quickly as possible. The building filled with smoke and debris, while people helped each other find the open stairwells and start the long descent to safety. As workers inside the building made their way down flight after flight of stairs, firefighters lugging heavy rescue gear trudged up, up, up in the opposite direction. They headed straight into the most dangerous areas. The firefighters who rushed to the scene knew it was useless to try to put out the flames. The massive amount of jet fuel in the plane had exploded into a raging fire that would be nearly impossible to stop. For the firefighters, this was a search and rescue mission to help free those who were trapped. Everyone in and around the North Tower felt confused and scared. Those who owned cell phones frantically dialed their loved ones, trying to make sure they were safe. So many people started making calls at the same time that the circuits jammed up, which made it almost impossible to communicate by phone. Just 17 minutes after the first plane hit the World Trade Center's North Tower, a second plane crashed into the South Tower. Just like in the North Tower, those who survived the initial impact of the plane sprang into action. They assisted friends, coworkers, and perfect strangers in escaping the building. But one thing was different. Now that the second plane had hit, everyone realized that this was not an unfortunate accident. It was a terrorist attack. Terrorism is when someone uses violence to scare and intimidate people, usually civilians, in order to achieve a political goal. The 19 men who carried out the attacks of September 11th were members of a terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda. A man named Osama bin Laden founded Al-Qaeda about 20 years before the September 11th attacks. His goal was to scare the people of the United States so much that the U.S. would stop using its military power to support governments in the Middle East. That way, bin Laden and his organization would be able to take over many of those Middle Eastern countries and force their citizens to follow an extreme form of the religion of Islam. One thing to remember is that the Al-Qaeda terrorists did not represent the beliefs of most Muslims. Islam is a centuries-old religion that is peaceably practiced by its followers, who make up almost a quarter of the world's population. Osama bin Laden was not a leader of Muslims or of the Islamic faith. He was just using the religion to achieve his terroristic goals. To carry out the attacks, bin Laden directed 19 of his followers to hijack or forcefully take over 4 airplanes and then purposely crash them into important crowded sites. 2 planes departed from Boston, Massachusetts. 1 took off from Newark, New Jersey. The last took off from Washington Dulles International Airport near Washington, D.C. Once the planes were in the air, the terrorists stormed the cockpits and wrested away control of the planes from the pilots. About a half hour after the attack on the South Tower in New York City, the 3rd plane was crashed into the Pentagon. The Pentagon is a 5-sided building complex near Washington, D.C. that serves as the headquarters for the U.S. military. The crash killed many people and also started a large fire. Firefighters hurried to the scene and immediately began battling the blaze. Some passengers on the 4th and final plane, United Flight 93, were able to use onboard phones or cell phones to call loved ones at home. They learned about the other 3 hijacked planes and feared that theirs was possibly headed toward an important building full of innocent people. Even though they were frightened and upset, the desperate passengers took the most democratic action possible. They voted on what to do next. As a group, they decided to rush to the front of the plane, storm the cockpit, and try to take control away from the hijackers. They had no time to lose. "Are you guys ready? Okay, let's roll," said passenger Todd Beamer. The passengers charged forward to confront the terrorist blocking the cockpit door. The hijackers inside the cockpit pitched and rolled the plane, trying to knock the passengers off balance. Based on the recordings retrieved from the flight, we can't be sure whether the band of heroic passengers made it inside the cockpit. What we do know for sure is that their quick thinking saved countless lives. Their courageous action caused the hijackers to crash the plane into an empty field in Pennsylvania instead of its intended target, which many historians believe was either the U.S. Capitol or the White House. At around the same time that the brave passengers were making their plan to storm the cockpit of Flight 93, another tragedy struck in New York City. The impact of the crash plus the heat of the burning jet fuel caused the South Tower of the World Trade Center to lose its stability. The building fell. Trapped office workers and the firefighters trying to rescue them perished in the collapse. A cloud of debris blasted through the streets, knocking pedestrians to the ground and covering the city in smoke and dust. About a half hour later, stunned viewers around the world witnessed the North Tower collapse on live television. Now both of the twin towers had fallen. The time between the hijacking of the first plane and the collapse of the North Tower was just over 2 hours. During the attacks, 2,977 people lost their lives. This number included hundreds of fearless first responders who rushed to the Twin Towers to try to save their fellow citizens. Thousands more were injured, and millions more were shocked and scared. What did the grieving country do? How could Americans go on after such a tragedy? In New York City, people did everything they could to help each other. With bridges, tunnels, and subways closed due to safety concerns, 500,000 people were stranded in Manhattan and needed a way out of the island city. Nearby boat captains steered their tugboats and ferries at top speed to Manhattan to help evacuate the frightened and injured citizens. All airplane flights in the United States were canceled, and those in progress were told to land immediately. International flights needed somewhere to land too. Many were diverted to smaller airports outside the US. Several grounded flights left thousands of passengers stranded in a tiny town in Canada called Gander for almost a week. Seeing the frightened, weary travelers, the residents of the town got to work. They opened their homes to total strangers and provided them with food, clothing, and hospitality until it was safe for them to continue on their journeys. Support continued to pour in during the weeks following the attacks. Famous actors and musicians held a benefit concert to raise money for the victims and their families. Everyday people donated money and fastened tiny American flags to their car antenna to show their support. But not everyone responded in helpful or kind ways. Some Americans, hearing that the terrorists were radical Muslims, began to blame all Muslims. Hate crimes against Muslims and people from South Asia increased greatly following the attacks. Unfortunately, this prejudice still exists many years later. Less than a month after September 11th, the United States invaded Afghanistan, a country in Asia that was controlled by a fundamentalist military group called the Taliban. The Taliban had been harboring and protecting al-Qaeda terrorists. US and allied forces from more than 40 countries drove al-Qaeda and the Taliban out of power, and the Afghan people elected their own government. Shortly before the 10-year anniversary of September 11th, US Navy SEALs finally located al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden and killed him. Despite these successes, the war dragged on and on as Taliban members kept trying to regain power. As a result, the war in Afghanistan became the longest war in US history. Back home, Americans continued to rebuild. Several new skyscrapers stand near the site of the original World Trade Center, including one that is now the tallest building in New York. The complex also houses a memorial commemorating those who lost their lives, plus a museum where visitors can learn more about what happened on September 11th. In addition, craftspeople rebuilt the damaged portion of the Pentagon, adding a memorial there as well. The Flight 93 National Memorial stands near the site of the fourth plane crash to honor the group of strangers who banded together in a time of fear and tragedy to become heroes. When something devastating happens in the world, parents and other family members try their best to protect young children from seeing scary images. After the Twin Towers collapsed on September 11th, television news programs showed video footage of the terrible moment again and again, 24 hours a day. Grown-ups had to change the channel or turn off the TV altogether to shield young children from witnessing one of America's worst moments played on repeat. It was a tough job, but parents and caretakers did their best to help make sense of what happened. Adults reassured children that they would do everything in their power to keep them safe. That's their job. But when scary things happen, whose job is it to reassure the adults? You'll find out in your next History Hop. Thanks for listening, and you can find a copy of this free unit study on September 11th at pandiapress.com. And that also includes the History Hop chapter that you can read together as a family. Thanks.